people have heard of the concept of the paradox of sovereignty? Okay, one. This is a really interesting idea, actually. It blew me away when I first heard it. So the basic idea is, like, once kings had this arbitrary power of life and death over their subjects. That's what sovereignty actually means. Nowadays, it is the people who are sovereign. That's the and over time, this idea came to be attached to democracy. That's what democracy was. Now, there's a basic problem. So, like, in theory, the police, the government, it's a monopoly of coercive force. They're the only people who have the legitimate right to use violence. Why is it legitimate for them to use violence? Because they are enforcing the law, right? Where does the law come from? The law comes from the Constitution. Okay, where does the Constitution come from? The legitimacy of the Constitution. The legitimacy of the Constitution comes from the people. That's popular sovereignty, right? How did the people actually establish the legitimacy of the Constitution? Through violent revolution. So, in other words, the legitimacy of the code of laws which allows the police to use force comes from acts of illegal violence, which is what revolution is. Because after all, I mean, the people who created modern constitutions, the American French Revolution, all committed treason according to the laws under which they were brought up. Violent treason, the uprising. So this creates a basic problem. If sovereign power is ultimately, the legitimacy comes from the right of the people to revolt, well, how do you tell the difference between the people and a rampaging mob? When do you have to do what they say, and when is it okay to kill them? Nobody's actually ever been able to solve this problem legally. The basic answer seems to be in retrospect. If they win, that was the people. All right, so there's a basic problem in the very idea of sovereignty. All right, but let's get back to democracy. Now, it's important to remember, and whenever I like to annoy liberals, or actually most Americans, I always point out to them that nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution does it say anything about America being a democracy. Those guys hated democracy. They were explicitly against it. They thought democracy meant what we do: popular rule, general assemblies, councils, Athenian-style direct democracy and deliberation. They thought, explicitly said, this is the worst form of government. It's mob rule. It'll lead to, the kind of argument was it'll lead to oppression of minorities. The particular minority they had in mind being the rich. And John Adams is really explicit. He said, how could we have majority rule? That's ridiculous. We have 1 million people with property, 9 million people with no property. First thing that happens is they'll abolish the debts. The second thing, they'll redistribute the land. But they got this ingenious idea that, well, we have to have popular sovereignty. How will we do that? Elections. Elections will be the way that the people sort of express their sovereignty, the power of kings. Now, and they took this old English habit of elections. But this is the interesting thing. There had been elections going on in England at least back to the 1100s. Many parliamentary people were elected. It never occurred to anybody in England or other countries where they practiced elections that elections had anything to do with democracy. In fact, if you look at history, democracy, at least in the Western tradition, elections have always been assumed to be the aristocratic mode of selecting leaders, because the aristocracy means the best. A small group of elite people decide, allow their followers to decide which of them is the best of all. And it goes back to Homer. I mean, even a lot of those guys, sort of heroic aristocrats are often selected by their followers by acclaim or other means. Greek democracy is warrior democracy as well. And yet Greek elections were held in oligarchic states and not in democratic states which ran by popular assemblies. You know what the actual democratic mode of selecting people to fulfill magistrates or other positions was? Anybody know this? What's that? Dice, lottery, yeah. Athens used this widely. Florence, other democratic states in the Middle Ages. You know, what they did was everybody, you know, you could take a test for basic literacy and competence, and then they, if you want to do it, it's like jury duty, except it's voluntary. They put your name in the hat and select people. All right. So they decided not to go through lottery and to create this sort of what they called an aristocracy of achieved aristocracy, an aristocracy not of birth, but of knowledge and competence, which would run America. But it was not assumed to be a democratic thing. In fact, what their model was Rome, the Roman Republic. That's why we have a Senate. And essentially the mechanisms of government were set up to suppress the dangers of democracy, as they called it, just have a limited democratic element for especially taxes and things like that.